All right, so everyone knows code reviews can be a little scary,
Yeah.
especially when you're just starting out.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like sending your code out there, and hoping it doesn't get just totally ripped apart.
Yeah, it's definitely a vulnerable feeling.
But that's exactly what we're diving into today.
That's right.
Figuring out how to not just survive code reviews,
Right.
but actually make this whole process work for you.
Absolutely.
I'm really excited about this one.
Me too.
We've got a fantastic article from CodeSkill.xyz.
Okay.
It's called Code Review Gauntlet, Giving and Receiving Feedback.
Catchy title.
Right.
Yeah.
They've got some really solid advice in there and even some interesting stories.
Oh, I love that.
From real developers.
Yeah, because I think seeing how other people have gone through this process can be really helpful.
For sure. So let's start with the part that probably makes everyone a little nervous.
Okay.
Actually receiving feedback.
Right, and it's so easy to take those comments personally, especially as a junior developer.
Especially.
You're just going out, you're like, oh my gosh, they hate my code.
Right.
But it's really important to remember,
Yeah.
it's not about you.
Mm-hmm.
It's about making the code better.
Yeah. It's like that story from the article
Okay.
where that junior developer gets like 20 comments
Oh,
on their first pull request.
ouch.
Right? But the takeaway there isn't to be discouraged by the
Mhm.
number of comments. It's about understanding those suggestions.
Exactly, and using them to improve.
To improvement.
Yeah,
Yeah. And, you mentioned the experience level plays a role
for sure.
in how we kind of perceive that feedback.
Absolutely.
So how might a junior developer approach feedback differently than, say, a mid-level or senior developer?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think for junior developers,
Mm-hmm.
it's so important to focus on understanding the why
The why.
behind each suggestion.
So not just like, oh, I need to change this, but why do I need to change this?
Exactly.
What's
Like,
the
why
why?
is this a better approach?
Right.
And don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions.
Yeah.
If something's not clear,
Mm-hmm.
that shows you're engaged and eager to learn.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, for mid-level developers,
Yeah.
they're often in that position
Right.
where they're getting feedback,
Mhm.
but they're also giving it to others.
Totally. It's like a feedback sandwich.
It is. It's a feedback sandwich generation.
They're in the middle.
They're in the middle.
And they might be getting feedback on things like
Okay.
asynchronous programming
Asynchronous programming.
or more complex design patterns.
Hold on now.
Yeah.
You can't just drop asynchronous programming and design patterns in there
Oh, you're right.
without giving us at least like a quick, what is that?
You got me. Okay, so asynchronous programming is basically
Yeah.
a way to make your code more efficient
Okay.
by allowing different parts of a program to run at the same time.
So it's like multitasking for code.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And then design patterns.
Yeah.
Those are like pre-made blueprints
Like-
for solving common coding problems.
Like templates almost.
Yeah, kind of like templates. And they help make your code more organized
Right.
and easier to maintain.
So mid-level developers are dealing with more of that intricate stuff
They are.
and probably starting to give feedback on it too.
Right. It's like this next level of code review where
Right.
they're balancing receiving and giving feedback.
Yeah. And speaking of, kind of moving up the ladder,
Mm-hmm.
how does feedback usually look for senior developers?
Oh, that's a good one.
I imagine it gets pretty high level.
It does. Senior developers often receive feedback on like broader architectural decisions
Right.
or the long-term maintainability of the code.
So it's less about like, you missed a semicolon.
Right. Less about the nitty-gritty
Okay.
and more about the big picture.
Big picture stuff. Yeah.
They might even have their entire approach questioned,
Wow.
which can be a challenge even for experienced developers.
Yeah, I bet.
The article mentions this senior developer
Oh, yeah.
who thought they had this really clever shortcut, and it ended up backfiring.
Oh, no.
Cost them a whole weekend to fix.
Ouch.
Yeah. So it just goes to show,
Yeah.
even the most seasoned professionals can learn from feedback.
Right. Nobody's above a little constructive criticism.
Exactly. Continuous learning is key.
It's essential. So we've seen how feedback can look different
Right.
depending on where you are in your career.
Mhm.
But that one thing that stays constant
Yeah.
is the importance of approaching it with a growth mindset.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic point.
Yeah.
It's not about perfection.
Right.
It's about using feedback as a tool for constant improvement.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks.
All right, so we've tackled receiving feedback.
We did.
But now let's flip the script
Okay.
and talk about giving feedback that's actually helpful,
I like it.
not hurtful.
Yeah, because that's where I think a lot of people trip up.
Yeah.
It's one thing to take feedback gracefully,
Right.
but it's a whole other skill to give it effectively.
Absolutely. And for junior developers especially,
Yeah.
it can be so intimidating to critique somebody else's code.
Especially if they're more senior than you.
Right. Like, who am I to tell this person anything?
Yeah, I remember feeling that way early in my career.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I was always worried about coming across as, like, arrogant or
Yeah.
inexperienced.
Right. You don't want to step on any toes.
Exactly.
But the article actually encourages junior developers to jump into that code review process. And they had a good example of this.
Yeah, they did. There's this story about
so-
this junior developer who found, like, a simple typo
Okay.
in a senior developer's code.
A typo.
And they were so hesitant to point it out.
I bet.
But the senior developer was so appreciative.
Oh, that's awesome.
Right? It just goes to show
Yeah.
that even small contributions can be valuable.
So don't be afraid to speak up, even if you're brand new to the team.
Exactly.
So what would you say are some good starting points for junior developers
That's a good question.
who are just beginning to give feedback?
I think focusing on clarity is key.
Clarity.
For
Okay.
example, they could suggest adding a comment
Right.
for better readability
Okay.
or point out a variable name that could be more descriptive.
That's about focusing on those small, concrete improvements.
Exactly.
Got it. But what happens as developers progress? How does the feedback they give and receive change
Okay.
as they become more mid-level?
Well, as developers gain experience, they start to give feedback on more complex aspects of the code.
Okay.
They might be reviewing things like function design,
Right.
code structure,
Yeah.
or even testing strategies.
So the feedback gets a bit more technical
It does.
as they move up the ladder.
Yeah, and I think the way you deliver that feedback
Yeah,
becomes even more
for
crucial.
sure. So how do you do that?
Well, the article had some really great examples
Okay.
of how to phrase feedback constructively.
Like what?
For instance, instead of saying,
Oh.
this is messy, which can feel kind of personal,
Yeah.
you could say something like,
Okay.
I'm loving the logic here,
Yeah.
but maybe we could break this function down for readability.
Oh, that's a much better way to put it.
Right. You're acknowledging the good
You are.
while also suggesting an improvement.
Exactly. And as you become a senior developer,
Yeah.
I imagine the focus often shifts to mentoring and guiding others.
It does.
It's less about finding specific errors
Yes.
and more about helping your team write cleaner, more efficient, more maintainable code.
It's about the big picture.
So it's big picture thinking, not nitpicking every line of code.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about setting a positive tone for the whole team.
I like that. And speaking of positive tone,
Oh, yeah.
the article mentions this concept of review roulette,
Yes.
where team members randomly praise each other's solid code.
I love that idea.
I thought that was brilliant.
It's such a good way to boost morale
It
because
is.
it's so easy to focus on what needs fixing.
Right.
But celebrating the good stuff is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've covered giving feedback at different stages
Well, yeah.
of a developer's career.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one point I want to circle back to.
Okay.
The idea of turning critiques into questions.
Oh, yes. That's a technique I use all the time.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Give us an example.
Okay, so instead of just saying,
Yeah.
this won't scale,
Which is kind of a blunt statement.
it is a little bit.
Yeah.
You could ask,
Okay.
how would this handle a larger data set?
Oh, I see.
It encourages the developer to think critically
It does.
and often leads to a more productive conversation.
It's a subtle shift,
It is
but it can make a big difference
huge difference.
in how that feedback is received.
Absolutely.
It's like you're collaborating on a solution
Exactly.
rather than just pointing out flaws.
Yeah, and that collaborative spirit
Yeah.
is what makes code reviews so powerful.
So it's not just about catching bugs.
Right.
It's about learning and growing together.
As a team.
All right, so we've covered surviving feedback.
We did.
Yeah. And giving feedback effectively.
We did.
But how do we actually leverage code reviews
Yes.
to level up our coding game?
Good question.
That's what I want to dive into next.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've talked about how to be on the receiving end of feedback.
Right.
Now let's flip the script and talk about giving feedback that's actually helpful,
Right.
not hurtful.
Yeah, I think this is where a lot of people get tripped up.
Yeah.
It's one thing to take feedback gracefully, but it's a whole other skill to give it well,
Absolutely.
especially for junior developers.
Yeah,
It can be so intimidating to critique someone else's code.
right. Especially if that person is more senior than you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I remember feeling that way early in my
Yeah.
career. Like, I was always worried about coming across as arrogant or
You
inexperienced.
don't want to step on anyone's toes.
Exactly.
But you know what's interesting is the article actually encourages junior developers
Oh, yeah.
to jump into the code review process.
I like that.
And they had a really good example of this.
Okay, what was it?
It was a story about this junior developer who found a simple typo in a senior developer's code.
A typo.
And they were so hesitant to point it out,
I bet.
but the senior developer was super appreciative.
Oh, that's nice.
So it just goes to show that even seemingly small contributions can be valuable.
Absolutely.
So what would you say are some good starting points for junior developers
Okay, let me think.
who are just beginning to give feedback?
I think focusing on clarity is key.
Clarity.
So, for example, they could suggest adding a comment to make the code more readable.
Okay.
Or they could point out a variable name that could be more descriptive.
So it's really about focusing on those small, concrete improvements.
Exactly.
Okay, but then what happens as developers kind of progress?
Right.
How does the feedback they give and receive change as they become more mid-level?
Well, as developers gain more experience,
Right.
they start to give feedback on more complex aspects of the code. So they might be reviewing things like function design, code structure, or even testing strategies.
So it gets a bit more technical
It does.
as they move up that ladder.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And the way you deliver that feedback becomes even more important.
So how do you do that?
Well, the article had some really great examples
Oh, yeah.
of how to phrase feedback constructively.
Like what?
For instance, instead of saying, "This is messy,"
Right.
which can feel kind of personal,
Yeah.
you could say something like, "I'm loving the logic here, but maybe we could break this function down for readability."
Oh, that's so much better.
Or you're acknowledging the good and suggesting an improvement.
Exactly.
And then as you become a senior developer,
Yeah.
I imagine the focus often shifts to mentoring and guiding.
It does?
It's less about finding specific errors
Right.
and more about helping your team write cleaner, more efficient, more maintainable code.
It becomes about the big picture.
So it's less nitpicking every line of code
Yeah.
and more about big picture thinking. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about setting a positive tone for the whole team.
And the article actually mentioned this concept of review roulette,
Oh, yeah, I love that one.
where team members randomly praise each other's code.
It's such a great idea.
It's brilliant
It's a really good way to boost morale.
because it's easy to focus on what needs to be fixed,
Right.
but celebrating the good stuff is important too.
For sure.
Huh.
So we've covered giving feedback at different stages of a developer's career.
Yeah, we have.
But there's one point I want to circle back to.
Okay, what's that?
This idea of turning critiques into questions.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I use this technique all the time.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so instead of just saying, "This won't scale,"
Which is kind of a blunt statement.
it can be.
Yeah.
You could ask, "How would this handle a larger data set?"
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. It encourages the developer to think critically,
It does.
and it often leads to more productive conversation.
It's subtle, but it can make a big difference.
A huge difference in how the feedback is received.
It's like you're collaborating on a solution
Exactly.
rather than just pointing out flaws.
Yeah, and that collaborative spirit
Yeah.
is really what makes code reviews so powerful.
So it's not just about catching bugs, it's about learning and growing together.
As a team.
All right. So we've covered surviving feedback.
We did.
We've covered giving feedback effectively.
It
But how do we actually leverage code reviews to level up our coding game?
I like it.
That's what I want to dive into next. We've talked about giving feedback and getting feedback.
Yeah.
But I think the most exciting part of this whole thing is how we can actually use code reviews
Yeah,
to become better developers.
absolutely. It's like a built-in system for continuous learning.
It is. And it's not just about learning from the feedback you get directly.
Right.
It's about observing different coding styles, understanding different approaches to problem solving, picking up new techniques.
But free education.
It is. It's like having a front row seat to how other people think about code.
Exactly. And remember that junior developer from the article?
Oh, yeah, the one who had their function completely rewritten.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the one. Well, they didn't just accept that change.
Okay.
They took the time to really analyze
Yeah.
the better way
Mhm.
that the reviewer had suggested.
And didn't they end up discovering like a whole new technique?
They did. It was called list comprehensions.
This comprehension.
Yeah. They turned a potentially discouraging experience
Right.
into a learning opportunity.
That's awesome. So they basically leveled up their coding skills just from that one code review.
Just from taking the time to understand the feedback.
That's a perfect example of how code reviews can be like your secret weapon for skill development. It's like having a free mentor.
Right. Like a personal coding tutor.
Exactly. And then as you become more of a seasoned developer, code reviews can help you spot patterns and identify areas for improvement.
Yes.
Not just in your own code, but across the whole code base.
The big picture stuff.
Yeah. The article gave that example of a mid-level developer who noticed a team-wide habit of like lazy error handling during a review. And they didn't just flag it.
Okay.
They actually took the initiative to push a fix.
Good for them.
In their next pull request.
That's awesome.
Right. So they're not just pointing out the problem.
They're being proactive.
They're actually contributing to a solution.
I like that.
Which is huge. And for senior developers, I imagine code reviews become less about like finding bugs.
Right.
It's more about mentoring and knowledge sharing.
Absolutely. It's about guiding those less experienced team members.
Right.
Sharing those best practices and really making sure the team is moving in the right direction technically.
It's like passing the torch to the next generation of developers.
Making sure they have the tools and the knowledge to succeed.
Exactly. So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We talked about surviving feedback, giving feedback effectively, and even turning code reviews into a superpower for growth.
A superpower.
But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's this.
Okay, what is it?
Code reviews, while they can be intimidating, are ultimately about collaboration and learning.
They're a chance to connect with your team.
Yes.
Share knowledge and push each other to be better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks.
So before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge.
Okay.
Think about a recent code review that you've been a part of.
All right.
What's one thing you could have done differently, either as the reviewer or the reviewee, to make it a more positive and productive experience?
That's a great question to reflect on.
It is. And, you know, if you're feeling brave, head over to CodeSkill.xyz.
Oh, okay.
Share your code review stories.
I love that.
Whether they're tales of triumph or those, like, cringeworthy moments we all have.
Oh, we've all been there.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together.
We are.
Navigating this code review gauntlet, one pull request at a time.
One pull request at a time.
And hopefully with the insights we've shared today, those pull requests will feel a little less like entering a gladiator arena.
Right.
And a little more like a high five from a teammate.
Here's to turning code reviews into a positive force for growth and collaboration.
Cheers to that. All right, folks, that's a wrap on our code review deep dive.
It was a good one.
Until next time, happy coding.